On June the 9th and 10th, I will be with my friends in the Kretuzer String Quartet, Clifton Harrison, Mihailo Trantaflovsky and Neil Hyder, giving concerts at the Opera Festival. We're going to be playing two programs of music ranging from late works by Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart to a number of pieces by the composers that we collaborate with over a very long term, and two works by a composer who's been very much at the centre of our repertoire for many years, the South African-born Priya Rainier. In some ways, the works we're going to play reflect what we find interesting about quartet playing. What is that draws us back as individual musicians to this extraordinary genre, this, for us, this kind of workshop of musical ideas. And perhaps the Haydn and Mozart quartets are a really good place to start. We're going to play the last quartets, finished or nearly finished by both composers. Haydn's final quartet, his quartet sometimes labelled Opus 103, was a piece that he certainly did not intend to leave in the truncated form that we have it, a first movement and then a minuet and trio. But his disability, particularly the extreme hearing problems he was afflicted with, prevented him from doing any composing. And this work, its unfinished work, sat on the shelf in his room for some years up to his death, distressed him considerably. Unlike Beethoven, whose final years, or more than his final years, were inhibited, or sometimes some people say liberated, by his hearing loss, Haydn suffered from the opposite. He suffered from extreme sensitivity to sound, which prevented him from composing because even using the soft tones of a clavichord was too much for his ears to bear, so he was unable to compose. But the two movements that we have of this unfinished quartet, which would have been the last in the set of Opus 77 quartets, speaks to an incredible sensitivity as to what four people in a room, which is how Michael Finnessy has defined a string quartet, how four people in a room can work together and work apart. Little things to look out for, and this is something which perhaps is to be found in all the pieces which we find exciting from the genre, for this genre of the string quartet, is when people are working together, and when they're working together in a kind of agreement, semi-disagreement, in counterpoint, in almost at odds with each other. And if you look carefully at the Haydn quartet, particularly the first movement, you'll find that he plays with the idea that people can be apparently playing the same phrase, but articulated in multiple ways, as if you've got, for instance, people speaking in unison but accentuating different vowels or different consonants. This makes a sort of living organism of the phrase. In some ways, is an absolute definition of what's exciting about real chamber music. Not this idea, which is very popular in some quarters, that great chamber music is people sitting together and having an organized conversation in agreement. I can't imagine anything more boring or irritating, but rather the opportunity for people to have a muscular discourse, disagreements, loyalties struck up, friendships, disagreements, reflected in how the people in the room treat the music and how the music treats itself. It sounds a really obvious thing to say, but you have quite often more than four musical elements in the string quartet, and you have four people, all of whom have the capacity to represent more than one character. And that means you've got more than just the relationship between four people or four parts to play with, but the multifarious relationships between different characters that those people can represent, all the different ways with which they present similar characters when they're shared. And that's perhaps where Mozart's last string quartet is an amazing example. I think the most exciting thing about the last three quartets, which were dedicated to the King of Prussia, was not the thing which is usually talked about, the concertante cello parts, which certainly in the last quartet are not quite so striking as they are in the two previous, the K575 and K589, but rather that Mozart had found a new way of playing with four voices by almost denying them the opportunity to ever speak or sing at the same time. You could almost define this quartet as a series of duos and trios who happen to be playing in the same room. If you've got 4 people, you've got, for a start, you've got 2 completely different string trios, violin 1, viola and cello, or violin 2, viola and cello, and then maybe you've got another string trio, violin 2 and cello, and then all the duos which go with that. And in a similar way that Mendelssohn was going to be fascinated by this when he came to write his octet 3 decades later, which explores over 200 possible combinations of the 8 players in the room. Mozart does the same thing, constantly turning the ensemble upside down, turning the cello or the first violin or the viola or the second violin into soloist, into bass line, making holes in the ensemble. And this is reflected in how he actually treats the musical material, which is constantly destabilized. It's one of the earliest chamber works, quartet works, which actually plays with complicated isometric rhythms. In the last movement, which has got this kind of famous sort of country dance feeling which keeps emerging, he also has an amazing figure where each player in turn experiments with playing in groups of 5 semiquavers over the basic 2/4 structure that's circling round and round in the most crazy kind of way. And that inventiveness is something which pulls that work to all the pieces that we're playing. We're going to play both of Priya Rainier's surviving works for string quartet. The 1939 piece, generally called string quartet, is comparatively well known, and we've played it for many, many years. And I would go as far as to say this piece is a piece without which the mature quartets, certainly the second and third quartets of Michael Tippett and all the numbered quartets of Benjamin Britten, simply wouldn't have sounded or looked like they did without it. But curiously, this work never found its way into the canon. Alongside that piece, an absolutely extraordinary early work written in 1922 when the 19-year-old composer violinist, or in this case violinist, was studying at the Royal Academy of Music, having recently arrived from South Africa and still with her original first name of Ivy, not Priya Rainier. And she composed this, single movement, it's not really quite true, but this extraordinary structured dramatic movement for quartet, 5 or 6 minutes long, which begins and ends with a very non-European musing for the viola, which is reflected in the middle of the quartet by a sort of a dramatic recitative for the whole ensemble. And the main body of the music, if you like, the first and last big concerted tutti sections use rhythms and shapes which in some ways, if you were to hear them today not knowing where they come from, speak more to the post-Second World War minimalist language of California, or even what Kevin Volans was going to do in the late 70s and early 80s. It's absolutely extraordinary, and all the more extraordinary that this early essay in quartet writing was to a degree forestalled, because Rainier was told not to compose. Who knows what she would have done for the medium if she continued immediately. Alongside the Mozart, Haydn and Rainier works, we have a number of pieces of different scales and very, very widely ranging characters by a number of the composers, the living composers that it's our huge privilege to work with. We have 2 premieres. One, a premiere of a fantastic dramatic new clarinet quintet by David Horn. This piece was commissioned for us to play with the wonderful clarinetist Linda Merrick, with whom we've been exploring this medium of clarinet quintets for many years. It's resulted in new works from composers such as John McCabe and pioneering recordings of great works, for instance, by the late lamented Simon Bainbridge. New works from Michael Finnissy, who provides another piece for one of our concerts this week, which is an extraordinary thing, not a completion, but as he puts it, a continuation of the unfinished contrapuntus from the end of Bach's Art of Fugue, that moment where Bach writes his name in music, B flat, A flat, C, H, B natural, and then loses his sight. Now, what Fennessy has done is, and he insists this is not a completion, is play with the idea of what would happen if you keep this going. And his way of keeping it going involves the voices of a number of other composers that he admires who've been involved with this music. Along the way, he takes in, for instance, the voice of Donald Francis Tovey, very much regarded at the beginning of the 20th century as one of the great, if you like, great explainer composers of great music, certainly in the UK. Alongside that, we have works by composers such as Sadie Harrison, Australian-born, who I've been working with since I was very, very young, and who the quartet's been working with for over 2 decades. Her piece, The River Dreams of Winter, was inspired by the water that I'm sitting right next to now. In fact, by a series of paintings which I did of the river I live next to, the River Thames here. And it's an interesting structure, a little bit like the game that Mozart plays. It begins, well, it's a broken quartet in some ways. It begins with a fragment for violin alone, and then another violin joins, and then the viola joins for 2 more movements. That would have been the end of the piece, but this piece was written in 2020 during lockdown, and while the composer was writing it, the tragic death of George Floyd happened in Minnesota. And so the concluding movement, which we will play on Friday, is meditation on that. So effectively, the piece changed direction, and Sadie's thoughts about the quartet, about what she was writing for us, changed direction. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that music is a living thing. Just as much as performance is a living thing, you can't always be sure how it's going to turn out. Another important premiere for us is a work by David Matthews, with whom we've been working for many years. This is his 17th quartet. We have premiered both collectively and singly dozens of works by this fantastic composer. And this quartet, again, plays with the idea of a quartet as soloists and as a body together. It begins with a series of lyrical solo cadenza outbursts for each of the players. A number of David's quartets end with one player by themselves, often one player by themselves, not in a kind of lost and wondering way like you find at the end of Berg's Lyric Suite, but rather a player by themselves, trumpeting to heaven, if you like. There'll also be a beautiful piece by Ellen Aldeburgh, a piece called Remember, which is a wonderful demonstration of how much you can achieve with this medium with the simplest and most refined means. It's a poignant essay in understatement.